New gen to attitude wrestlers that succeeded in both eras. Let's watch.
In a previous video, we looked at superstars who successfully crossed over from WWF's Attitude Era all the way to the Ruthless Aggression Era. But what about those performers that succeeded into other eras by crossing over from the New Generation and then continuing to evolve their characters on into the Attitude Era? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with Steve Austin?
Oh, yes.
Of course, when he first joined the WWF roster at the end of 1995, he wasn't known as Stone Cold yet. No, at this point, Austin went by the moniker of the Ringmaster, a questionable gimmick which saw him be managed down to the ring by Ted DiBiase as his new $1 Million champion, and which saw the future Rattlesnake be afforded little opportunity to show the personality he had inside him. Thankfully then, this would change a few months later, as by the time that June's King of the Ring came around, the Texas native would have morphed into his more well-known incarnation and would begin his rise to the top with an iconic Austin 3:16 promo. And that rise only skyrocketed even further once his feud with Bret Hart started in the winter of that same year. In fact, you could make a solid argument that his submission match at WrestleMania 13 is one of the best ever and was the true beginning point of the Attitude Era. But even if you put that changeover point to be a little later, say at Survivor Series 1997 or WrestleMania 14, the fact remains that Austin would be the guy leading the charge into this new period of the company's history as its top babyface star regardless. Really, if you were to associate one person with the Attitude Era, then it would almost certainly be Stone Cold. And for that reason, he has to rank as one of the most successful examples of someone leveling up in the transfer over from one phase of WWE's existence to another. After all, had there not been an Austin in 1996 and 1997, then we may never have gotten the second boom period at all. Hell, WWF might have fully gone out of business. And that would mean others wouldn't be able to thrive during that time either, after getting themselves first established during the time of the New Generation, with one of the prime examples of this being our next subject, Triple H. Yes, if Austin was the #1 star of the late 90s and The Rock was a very close second, then you could argue Triple H slots in at third on that list, as during the Attitude Era, he managed to rise to the top of the card by becoming a multiple-time WWF champion. And that's a pretty big achievement considering the fact that in the era prior to this, he'd been a solid mid-card hand, though not someone who was ever threatening to breach the main event scene. Not that this means that his time during the New Generation was a failure, though. No, he had plenty of memorable moments there, too, such as his infamous hog pen match with Henry O. Godwin at In Your House 5 Seasons Beatings, his feud with Mark Marrow over the services of Sable, and his early bouts against a young Rocky Maivia. Then, of course, there's his part in The Click, the real behind-the-scenes powerhouse of mid-90s WWF, as between their members Triple H, Shawn Michaels, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and Sean Waltman, they pretty much ran things in WWF for a while. And while this would never be addressed on TV during the mid-90s, by the time the New Generation era was giving way to the Attitude Era in 1997, the game's allegiance with HBK became on-screen canon once they formed D-Generation X together. And it was the formation of DX which really led to the Cerebral Assassin being who he became at the turn of the millennium, because by using this group to boost him up, it wasn't long before he was on top of the card with the likes of Stone Cold, The Rock, and a few other people we'll get to in a moment. And once that happened, there was simply no stopping him, as since then, he's risen all the way to being the head booker of the company, and the guy who, alongside Nick Khan, is effectively in charge of day-to-day operations. Of course, even with his current backstage power, he hasn't been able to break down the forbidden door between WWE and AEW, which would allow for our next subject to return to WWE, someone who also found much success during both the New Generation and Attitude eras, Billy Gunn.
He brought up a good point, and I thought about that too. I feel like the reason why they were able to like continue into like new eras because they did such a great job like working with each other and bouncing off of each other. It felt like very authentic and genuine. You know what I'm saying? Like they were able to carry, it felt like they were able to carry each other so well because they worked together so well. So just like he was able to like reinvent himself or like bounce into a new era and like, you know, team up with HBK or whatever, and they work together. They work together so well. And I feel like, you know, Austin, Rock, Triple H, HBK, everybody, they just, I don't know, they just meshed together So I feel like that's why they were able to like succeed for so long, and they had really great characters and really great personalities. So I like that. I like that he brought that up because that's what I was thinking too. Like I feel like they were able to carry each other just based off of like, you know, the synergy was there between everybody, and it was so believable and great, and that made the stories even better because they had great chemistry. So
Yes, with him still being a regular fixture on TV down in
it's a good
Jacksonville,
point.
it can be easy to forget that Billy got his first big break back in 1993, as that was when he was hired by Vince McMahon to be one half of his newest tag team, the Smoking Guns, alongside Bart Gunn. And while this did lead to the future Daddy Ass finding some measure of success, as between 1993 and 1997 he'd become a 3-time tag team champion with Bart, it wasn't until the dawn of a new era that he really came into his own as a performer. What changed then? Well, he joined forces with the Road Dogg
See?
Jesse James and formed the New Age Outlaws, basically the wrestling personification of South Park. And with the Outlaws being such a quick hit with fans despite being heels, it wasn't long before WWE tried to capitalize on the whole thing by having them become members of D-Generation X 2.0 when Triple H reformed it in his own image in early April of 1998. That's right,
Whoa.
now that they were part of the hottest stable in the company, the lovable tag team scamps could finally turn babyface like everyone wanted.
Wow.
And this particularly benefited Billy Gunn because by the time 1999 rolled around, there would be pushes made to have him morph into a singles star. Sure, this singles run might not have worked out in the long run, partially because Billy was absolutely ethered in a promo by The Rock during the lead up to that year's SummerSlam. But it wasn't exactly the end of the world for him because he always had his partnership with Road Dogg to fall back on, and this saw him remain in a prominent role right up until the era of
Also, I like how everybody kind of like clicks up back then. I mean, they still kind of do that today, but it just felt different when people would like click up back then because it did feel like low key. It kind of felt like a gang, like this gang versus that gang. I don't know. That's just how I feel.
Attitude came to an end and beyond. No, he was never a top guy like Austin or Triple H, but not everyone can be. Rather, some people's roles are to fill out the mid-card in a way that entertains fans the most. And whether it was the mid-90s or the turn of the millennium, there were few people on the WWF roster better at doing this than Billy Gunn. But of course, he's not the only member of the current AEW roster who succeeded in both the Attitude Era and in the New Generation, because the same exact thing could be said about our next subject too, Jeff Jarrett. Really though, is it any surprise Jeff Jarrett would succeed in multiple eras? Because if history has told us anything, it's that when the apocalypse finally comes, the only things which will survive are Keith Richards and Jeff Jarrett. And he was proving his value to the Fed specifically as far back as 1993, as this was when he was first hired full-time by the company. What was he doing then? Well, he was playing his country music singer character, the one which introduced us all to the gem With My Baby Tonight. Actually, maybe we need to rethink that list of greatest songs of all time. But so good was this one, in fact, that it didn't matter if Jarrett wasn't actually the one singing it in the end.
Oh my
And it didn't
goodness.
matter if he walked out on the company for the first time in late 1996. He'd be invited back again
That
in
costume.
1998, right at the point the Attitude Era was reaching its full swing. And in keeping with the changing tone of the show then, Jarrett morphed into a whole new gimmick upon starting his second run in WWF, one which eventually saw him play the role of misogynistic cartoon character. How would this work out for him in the end? Good and bad, because while it did see him get a beatdown from China for his actions, it would also lead to him getting a huge payout from Vince McMahon before splitting once more, a payout so big it later allowed him to start TNA, a company which somehow, inexplicably, still exists today despite all they've been through over the years. Yes, like with Billy Gunn, while Jeff Jarrett was never a main eventer during the New Generation and Attitude eras, he still played a crucial role in making the show as entertaining as it was back then. It's just a shame he never really got a chance to properly mix it up with our next subject, someone who was also there for both eras.
Oh
the
my
one,
God.
The only Mick Foley. Of course, for Mrs. Foley's baby boy, it all began in 1996, or at least it did in terms of his WWF run, as this was when he was brought on board to be the new foil of The Undertaker. And while for a lesser performer, this could have resulted in him being seen as a flavor of the month once that feud was over, for Mick, it was only the beginning. So when the Attitude Era finally dawned around 1997-1998, then the man with the three faces was primed and ready to rise to the top of the card as one of Vince McMahon's most beloved acts.
What the
It didn't
hell?
matter if it was Mankind, Cactus Jack, or Dude Love. It didn't even matter if it was Commissioner Foley. You could always count on the fact that whenever he was on screen, it was going to be gold. Need an example of just how great Mick Foley's run was at the turn of the millennium? Just look at the time that he won the world title on the January 4th episode of Raw to probably the biggest pop ever heard in a wrestling show.
We all
And
know
if you need
that.
any further evidence, then just look at his iconic Hell in a Cell match with The Undertaker, his hardcore brawl with Triple H at the 2000 Royal Rumble, or his peak.
That reaction I did some months back has made me look at him so differently. Like, that video was so good. Like, a lot of things in that video I did not know about him. He's really goated. Like I said, I'm not messing with you. If this is your fave, you got it.
Peak Attitude Era bout against Steve Austin at May 1998's Over the Edge in your house. Honestly,
He
you
put
can count
himself
on
through
one
so
hand the
much.
people who made a bigger impact in wrestling during the late 90s and early 2000s. And you could probably count on one hand the people who were as instrumental in helping WWF transition into that era from the new generation 1 too. Really, you're talking about a short list made up of the likes of Stone Cold, The Rock, DX, and our next subject, The Undertaker. Why The Undertaker? Come on now, if you have to ask that question, then you must not have seen any WWF during the 90s, as during this decade, he was an absolute pillar of the promotion. And sure, he was a pillar after that too, but for the purposes of this video, it's the period between around 1993, the point that Hulk Hogan left the company, and 2001 that we want to cover. Of course, this is because, roughly speaking, that would cover both the New Generation and Attitude Eras, with the former being a time which saw Mark Calaway fully establish himself as a top-level guy in WWF. No, the feuds he had during this period weren't always great. In fact, a lot of the time they were downright terrible. But throughout them, the dead man always managed to retain his aura as a big star, no matter what. And thank God he did, because once the Attitude Era came around in late 1997, early 1998, he was able to serve as an excellent foil for the likes of Stone Cold Steve Austin and Mick Foley. Hell, the former feud even gave us the memorable Highway to Hell showdown between the pair at SummerSlam 1998, and as for the latter, well, we all remember Hell in a Cell. How could anyone ever forget it? But that wasn't all the Phenom was doing during the Attitude Era, as aside from this, he'd also have an excellent feud and partnership with his kayfabe brother Kane, one which saw the pair oscillate between teaming up and going at each other's throats all throughout the late 90s and into the early 2000s as well. It didn't matter if Mark Calaway was in his Lord of Darkness mode or whether he was playing the American Badass. One thing you could always count on during that golden time was that he and the Big Red Machine would be closely intertwined in everything they did. Honestly, it's hard to imagine what the Attitude Era would have looked like without The Undertaker there. And it's probably even harder to imagine the New Generation era without him, because that was a time which really needed his star power the most. Not that he was holding the company afloat by himself back then, though, as there were other great acts too, one of which is our next subject.
Oh
Goldust. That's right, years after he was the
Oh
natural
my
in
goodness,
WCW
my
and years
Goldust.
before he became a living legend in the modern day, Dustin Rhodes was creating probably his best incarnation when in 1995 he joined WWF under the all-new gimmick of Goldust.
Oh my goodness.
Who was Goldust? Well, he was a sexually androgynous, old Hollywood-obsessed, riddle-wrapped in an enigma, someone who was very hard to pin down and who certainly challenged a lot of wrestling fans' perceptions at the time. Yes, Goldust was a unique character, and you could argue it was actually the earliest starting point for the Attitude Era that would come a couple of years down the line. After all, while 1995 and 1996 were certainly still a PG child-friendly time, Goldust was pushing things to the absolute limit with what he was doing. And that made it easy for him to segue when the Attitude Era finally dawned then, as he didn't really have to change much up at all here to keep up with the times. But that's not to say he didn't change things anyway whenever he felt like it, and the way he did this was by going even further with the gimmick when he transformed into the artist formerly known as Goldust, an altogether indecipherable figure who regularly cosplayed as other famous people, such as Marilyn Manson or even his own father, Dusty Rhodes. And once he was done exploring that side of himself, he'd even at one point briefly take on a born-again Christian gimmick, with this allowing him to be something entirely different again. Of course, it'll probably always be that original version of Goldust he's best known for though, the one from the new generation, as it felt so fresh, so unique when it first arrived. It's hard to fully convey how out there it was. But it wasn't all about things like this when it came to the stars of the 90s. No, sometimes all you had to do to get over during that period was to be a simple tough guy. And there were few people back then who were more legitimately tough than our next subject, Ron Simmons. Yes, as a former NFL defensive tackle and the first African American in history to ever become WCW World Champion, Ron Simmons already had quite a reputation for himself before he ever arrived in WWF. So when he first showed up there in 1996 then, there were big expectations for him. Unfortunately though, those expectations weren't exactly met right away because rather than be treated like the high-level athlete he was, the Georgia native would be given the gimmick of a Roman gladiator named Farouk Assad.
Okay.
That said, while this could have been a disaster for his career, it only ended up being a momentary blip as pretty quickly Vince McMahon would realize the whole thing wasn't working. And that was why he repackaged Simmons as Farouk, with his gimmick now being that he was an activist and leader of his own faction. And this meant wherever he went then, his Nation of Domination stable wouldn't be far behind him.
Yeah, I didn't
But by
know
the time
that.
the Attitude Era was dawning in 1997, it would be the Nation that proved to be his temporary downfall, as when a young Rocky Maivia, someone who'd joined the group a few months prior, decided he wanted to be the new leader, he was able to convince the rest of the crew to turn on Farouk and give him the boot. How would the now exiled former leader react to this? That's simple. He'd pick himself up, dust himself off, and start a new tag team with Bradshaw called the Acolytes. And while this was a bit wild at first, with it seeing the two hard-drinking Southern boys becoming members of the Undertaker's Satanic Ministry of Darkness, eventually it allowed them to show their true colors when they altered things slightly so that instead of being the Acolytes, they were the Acolyte Protection Agency, or APA for short. That's right, one of the most beloved acts of the turn of the millennium, the APA allowed Ron Simmons and his tag partner to do what they did best each and every week, and that was sit backstage drinking and playing cards. And if anyone ever needed them to come out to the ring and back them up in a fight, they were only too happy to do this as well, providing the price was right, of course. Obviously then, this was one that both men enjoyed greatly, and it was one which continues to be well remembered to this day. But Ron Simmons wasn't the only former member of the Ministry of Darkness who found success in both the New Generation and Attitude Eras, because the exact same thing could be said of Mabel. Okay, we know his main event run in 1995 wasn't the best, but before that, Nelson Frazier was over as one half of Men on a Mission, the mid-90s tag team with a hip-hop gimmick built in the vein of DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince. So over were they, in fact. At a certain point, Vince McMahon started to see stars in his eyes when he looked at the big man, as he felt he had a new top guy in him. As we all know now, though, that run didn't exactly work out, and so it wasn't long before Mabel was relegated to more of a mid-card role on the show. But this didn't mean he wouldn't have a decent role going forward, as, come 1999, he'd have joined the Ministry of Darkness, and in the process, would take on a whole new, more gothic gimmick of Viscera. Sure, this might not have amounted to much more than him playing a henchman for the real big boss, someone who could be beaten up by the likes of Steve Austin or The Rock on a weekly basis. But it was better than whatever he was doing in 1995. And as Viscera, Nelson Frazier was able to add far more longevity to his career. Hell, it was the period we saw him not only briefly become the hardcore champion, but also at one point fully body splash a 77-year-old woman in Mae Young. And he wasn't the only big man who splashed his opponents on a regular basis back then either, because the same thing was happening with our next subject. Who are we talking about here? Why, Rikishi, of course. Now, we all remember Attitude Era Rikishi, the man who, if he wasn't dancing his way towards success in the 2000 Royal Rumble, was doing it for The Rock later that same year. But while his biggest success undoubtedly came at the turn of the millennium, Tolofa Fatu's time with WWF actually began in the era prior to that, the one built around the New Generation. That was where he first joined the Fed as one half of the Head Shrinkers. And after finding some success here, when Vince McMahon was looking for a new singles star in 1994 and 1995, he had the California native right there to play the roles of both Make a Difference Fatu and the Sultan. Of course, his real big success wouldn't come until 1999, though, as that was the period Rikishi dropped the Sultan act and instead morphed into the one he's best known for today, the man who, alongside his tag partners Scotty 2 Hottie and Grandmaster Sexay, took every opportunity he could to take a break from wrestling and have a dance instead. And whenever Rikishi danced back during the Attitude Era, you could be sure everyone was going to be paying attention. Hell, it wasn't even uncommon to see his opponents join in once the match was over. Sure, this fun babyface role would ultimately have the legs cut out from under it when in 2000, WWF made the terrible decision to have the big man be revealed as the one who ran over Steve Austin. But if nothing else, at least that reveal gave us a great meme about doing it for The Rock. So it wasn't all bad. Still though, if you want to think of the good times for Rikishi, then you probably think of his time with Too Cool, as when they were at their peak, they were so entertaining, they took what should have been a mid-card act and rode it all the way to the main event. And a lot of the reason they were able to do this was because of the winning charms of the father of the Usos. But then everyone we've discussed today had to have some level of skill in order to succeed during both the New Generation and Attitude Eras. After all, if they hadn't, they would have never lasted for as long as they did.
But yeah, like I mentioned earlier, every wrestler on this list had such a great character and a big personality. So you put them in a feud with another wrestler with a lot of character and personality, that is gonna go far. That is going to, like, the promos are gonna be crazy, the matches are gonna be crazy, commentary is gonna be crazy. So I definitely feel like, you know, they were able to like kind of carry each other into like the next era or the next generation, because they were able to like bounce off of each other so well and make it feel so realistic and believable. And that's not to say like individually they won't be great like on their own, but you put them in a feud with someone who is like a big star, who could like, I guess, like, you know, just make the promos magic, that really helps. But yeah, that's gonna do it for this reaction, you guys. Make sure you leave some likes and comments down below. Let me know what you guys think, and I will see you in the next one. Toodles.